He was a man who was born illegitimate, a man who was denied the right to a formal education, a man who never attended a university, a man who was left-handed in an age when left-handedness was considered a mark of the devil, a man who wrote his notebooks in mirror writing, a man who was a vegetarian in a world that ate meat, a man who was a pacifist in a world of constant warfare, a man who was a scientist when science was considered heresy, a man who was an artist when art was a craft, a man who was an engineer when engineering was a trade, a man who was a musician, an anatomist, a geologist, a botanist, an architect, a cartographer, a military engineer, and a man who was deeply curious about everything. He was a man who was a heretic, a visionary, a man who was so far ahead of his time that he seemed to belong to another century, another world, another dimension. He dreamed of flying machines, of submarines, of tanks, of helicopters, of calculating machines, of mechanical lines that could walk and roar, of cities that were built on canals, of bridges that could span vast rivers, and of weapons that could destroy entire armies. He was a man who was a prisoner of his own genius, a man who was commissioned to paint some of the most famous images in the history of art, but who often left them unfinished, a man who was obsessed with the perfection of his work, a man who was never satisfied with what he had done. This is the story of Leonardo da Vinci, a man who was not just an artist but a polymath, a man whose insatiable curiosity and relentless pursuit of knowledge made him the embodiment of the Renaissance, a man whose notebooks contain ideas that were not realized for centuries after his death. But here is what most people do not realize about Leonardo da Vinci, the man who is remembered as the quintessential Renaissance man, the man who painted the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper. The man who drew the Vitruvian Man was also a man who was deeply flawed, a man who was often unable to complete his projects, a man who was a procrastinator, a man who was a procrastinator, a man who was a perfectionist, a man who was a loner, a man who was a pacifist who worked as a military engineer, a man who was a man of immense talent and immense insecurity, a man who was a visionary, and a man who was deeply human. To understand Leonardo da Vinci, you have to go back to the beginning, to the rolling hills of Tuscany, to the small town of Vinci, a place of olive groves and vineyards, a place of beauty and simplicity, where he was born on April 15, 1452, into a world that was defined by the struggles of the Italian city-states. He was the illegitimate son of Ser Piero da Vinci, a notary, and a peasant woman named Caterina. His birth was a scandal, a mark of shame that would follow him for the rest of his life. He was taken into the household of his father, who had married a woman of his own class, and he was raised by his stepmothers and his grandparents. He was a boy who was different, a boy who was curious, a boy who was always asking questions, a boy who was always drawing. He was a boy who was a prodigy, a boy who showed a remarkable talent for art from a very young age. He was also a boy who was deeply aware of his illegitimacy, a boy who was trying to prove his worth, a boy who was determined to rise above his circumstances. His formal education was limited. He was taught the rudiments of reading, writing, and arithmetic, but he was denied the classical education that was available to the sons of the aristocracy. He was a boy who was forced to learn from the world, a boy who was a self-taught genius. In 1466, when Leonardo was 14 years old, his father apprenticed him to Andrea del Verrocchio, one of the most renowned artists in Florence. It was a turning point in his life. Florence was the cultural capital of Italy, a city of immense wealth, beauty, and ambition. It was a city that was at the center of the Renaissance, a city that was a crucible of creativity and innovation. Verrocchio was a master of many arts: painting, sculpture, goldsmithing, and engineering. He was a man who taught Leonardo the fundamentals of art, the techniques of perspective, anatomy, and composition. Leonardo also learned the value of observation, the importance of seeing the world with a fresh eye. He was a young man who was developing his own unique style, a man who was beginning to question the conventions of his time. He remained in Verrocchio's workshop for many years, and he began to collaborate with his master on a number of projects. He is said to have contributed to Verrocchio's painting, The Baptism of Christ, painting the angel that is on the left side of the composition. It is said that Verrocchio was so impressed by the quality of Leonardo's work that he swore he would never paint again. It was a moment of recognition, a moment that demonstrated Leonardo's extraordinary talent. He was a young man who was not just an artist, but a man who was deeply curious about the world. He was a man who was constantly questioning, constantly observing, constantly experimenting. He was a man who was fascinated by the human body, and he began to dissect corpses to understand its structure. He was a man who was fascinated by the flight of birds, and he began to study their anatomy and their motion. He was a man who was fascinated by the properties of water, and he began to study the flow of rivers and the movement of waves. He was a man who was fascinated by the nature of light, and he began to study the science of optics. He was a man who was not content to simply accept the world as it was. He wanted to understand it. He began to fill his notebooks with drawings and observations, a vast and extraordinary record of his thoughts and his discoveries. His notebooks are a window into his mind, a glimpse into a genius at work. In 1482, Leonardo left Florence and traveled to Milan, a city that was a rival of Florence, a city that was ruled by the powerful Sforza family. He was seeking patronage, and he wrote a letter to Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, offering his services. It was a remarkable document, a letter that listed his skills as a military engineer, an architect, a sculptor, and a painter. He offered to build bridges, to design artillery, to plan fortifications, and to create statues. He was a man who was selling himself as a complete package, a man who was a one-man renaissance. He was also a man who was offering to paint The Last Supper, a work that would become one of the most famous paintings in history. The Duke was impressed, and he hired him. Leonardo remained in Milan for the next 17 years, a period of immense productivity and creativity. He worked on a variety of projects, including the design of the city's canals, the planning of a massive equestrian statue of the Duke's father, and the completion of The Last Supper, a fresco that is considered one of the masterpieces of Western art. He was a man who was at the height of his powers, a man who was achieving everything he had set out to achieve, but his life was also marked by his failures. He was a man who was often unable to complete his projects. He was a man who was a perfectionist, a man who was never satisfied with his work. He would spend years on a single painting, constantly revising, constantly altering, constantly rethinking his approach. He left many of his paintings unfinished, including the Adoration of the Magi and the Saint Jerome. He was a man who was often distracted by his other interests. He would spend hours studying the flight of birds, or dissecting a corpse, or designing a new weapon. He was a man who was a prisoner of his own curiosity. He was also a man who was a victim of his own ambitions. He was commissioned to create a massive equestrian statue of Francesco Sforza, a project that was never completed. He spent years planning the statue, designing the mold, and preparing for its creation. But the project was abandoned due to the war. He was a man who was a failure, a man who was often unable to realize his own visions. He returned to Florence in 1500, a man who was no longer a young prodigy, but a man who was an established master. He was commissioned to paint the Mona Lisa, a portrait that is perhaps the most famous painting in the history of art. It was a work that would take him years to complete, a work that he would carry with him until the end of his life, a work that is a testament to his genius and his obsession. The Mona Lisa is a painting that is simple in its composition, but profound in its complexity. The figure is seated in a simple pose, against a landscape of winding paths and distant mountains. But there is something about her smile, something about her gaze that is deeply enigmatic. It is a painting that has been the subject of countless interpretations, a painting that continues to fascinate and inspire. Leonardo's later years were marked by a growing sense of isolation and frustration. He was a man who was deeply skeptical of the world, a man who was often disappointed by the people he encountered. He was a man who was a pacifist, but he was a man who was constantly being asked to design weapons. He was a man who was a visionary, but he was a man who was often ignored. He was a man who was a genius, but he was a man who was often misunderstood. He left Italy for France in 1516 at the invitation of King Francis I. He was a man who was seeking a patron who would understand him, a patron who would appreciate his work and his ideas. He was welcomed with great honor, and he was given the title of first painter, engineer, and architect to the king. He spent his final years in France working on his projects, completing his notebooks, and reflecting on his life. He died on May 2nd, 1519, at the age of 67. He was buried in the chapel of Saint-Hubert at the Château d'Amboise. He was a man who had achieved immortality, a man whose name would be synonymous with genius, a man whose works would be studied and celebrated for centuries. The legacy of Leonardo da Vinci is one of the most profound in human history. He is remembered as the quintessential Renaissance man, a man whose insatiable curiosity and relentless pursuit of knowledge made him a symbol of the human spirit. He has been honored with statues, monuments, and museums around the world. He is a man who is considered one of the greatest artists and thinkers in history. His works have inspired countless artists, writers, and scientists. His notebooks are a testament to his extraordinary mind, a record of his thoughts and his discoveries that continue to fascinate and inspire. But his legacy is also a story of contradictions. He was a man who was a genius, but he was also a man who was often unable to complete his projects. He was a man who was a visionary, but he was also a man who was often ignored. He was a man who was a master of many arts, but he was also a man who was often a victim of his own ambition. He was a man who was not just an artist. He was a man who was a scientist, an engineer, a philosopher, a humanist, and a man whose legacy will continue to shape the world for generations to come. Why should someone born today still care about Leonardo da Vinci? Because his life is a testament to the power of curiosity and the importance of creativity. He was a man who was born into a world of limitation, a man who was denied the right to a formal education, a man who was often marginalized and misunderstood. He was a man who was able to overcome the limitations of his birth through the power of his mind and his relentless pursuit of knowledge. He was a man who showed us that the most important thing is not the obstacles we face, but the way we respond to them. He was a man who showed us that the pursuit of knowledge is a noble endeavor, and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who believed in the power of the human imagination, and he was a man who was not afraid to dream. He was a man who changed the world, and his story will continue to inspire generations to come. He was a man who taught us that the most powerful force in the world is not violence, but curiosity. He was a man who showed us that the most important thing is not the success we achieve, but the difference we make in the world. He was a man who showed us that the pursuit of excellence is a noble endeavor, and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who was not just a painter. He was a man who was a poet, a philosopher, a visionary, and a legend. He was a man whose story will continue to inspire generations to come. He was a man who taught us that the most important thing is not the obstacles we face, but the way we respond to them. He was a man who showed us that even in the darkest hour, hope is possible, and that the human spirit is indomitable. He was a man who changed the world, and he will never be forgotten. He was a man who showed us that the most important thing is not the success we achieve, but the difference we make in the world. He was a man who showed us that the pursuit of excellence is a noble endeavor, and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who was not just a hero. He was a man who was a legend, a man whose story will continue to inspire generations to come. He was a man who taught us that the most important thing is not the obstacles we face, but the way we respond to them. He was a man who showed us that even in the darkest hour, hope is possible, and that the human spirit is indomitable. He was a man who changed the world, and he will never be forgotten.